Redditor 1. I was 7 years old, living in an apartment in Chicago next door to my dad's old house. A detail I once thought made our world a little more familiar, a little more secure. For reasons I never understood, that particular night, my parents decided we should all sleep on the living room floor. I was nestled in between them, the soft hum of their breathing and the muted sounds of the city outside lulling me into a false sense of comfort. It was a warm, humid night, the kind that made the air feel thick and heavy. I remember the slight creak of the old wooden floor beneath me and the distant clatter of late-night traffic outside our building. I had drifted into a fitful sleep, my mind wandering in dreams of playgrounds and endless skies. Then, in the dead of night, so quiet that even the slightest sound seemed amplified, I awoke. At first, I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming, but as I slowly became aware, I noticed something odd. An orange glow, warm and pulsing, seeped through one of the second-floor windows. I sat up, my small heart pounding, and felt an inexplicable pull to investigate. I wanted to crawl over to that window, to get just 5 or 10 feet closer, to see what mystery lay beyond the glass. I could barely move, frozen by a mixture of wonder and dread. I remember how the orange light bathed the room in a surreal hue, washing away the familiar shapes of furniture and wallpaper, transforming everything into something unrecognizable. In my half-awake state, I mustered the courage to push myself upright. Peering out, I saw something that would etch itself into my memory forever. The house next door, the one I had always known as a constant in my young life, was gone. In its place hovered a craft, sleek and otherworldly, parked over an empty lot like it belonged there all along. The craft had the classic saucer shape, its surface reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights and the orange radiance that had drawn me to the window. I remember standing there, transfixed, feeling as if time had slowed to a crawl. Every second stretched out and I couldn't move an inch. It was as if I was locked in that spot, both terrified and mesmerized by what I was seeing. I stared in disbelief, my mind racing with questions I was too young to understand. How could the house simply vanish? What was that object, floating silently where a home once stood? I felt my throat tighten and my palms grow clammy, though I couldn't even grasp the concept of fear back then. I just knew that everything was different, and I was powerless to do anything about it. Then, in an instant that felt like an eternity, everything vanished. The glowing craft was gone, and I was pulled back into a haze of confusion as I suddenly woke up again, back on the living room floor, back in the comforting embrace of my parents. For a long moment I lay there, heart pounding, unsure if I had dreamed the whole thing. The remnants of the orange glow still seemed to dance in the corners of my eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something real. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, a figment of my wild, childish imagination. Yet, as I lay there later, I felt a wave of nausea building in my stomach. Before I could understand what was happening, I rolled over and puked my brains out. I wasn't normally prone to such reactions. I only ever threw up when I was really sick. That night, however, something in me was so unsettled that my body reacted violently, as if to expel the shock from within. In the days that followed, I ruminated on that night, trying to piece together the fragments of my memory. I remembered the sticky heat of the Chicago summer, the way the soft carpet had felt under my arms as I lay awake, and the lingering taste of bile on my tongue. I began to rationalize it all, convincing myself that I had been so scared by that inexplicable vision that my mind had conjured up a horrifying dream, a dream so vivid that it felt real, and so overwhelming that my body had rejected it in the only way it knew how. As the years passed, I tried to push that memory into the recesses of my mind, to dismiss it as nothing more than a bizarre childhood hallucination. Yet, even now, when I see a strange glimmer in the sky, or pass by an old building that reminds me of that lost house, I feel a shiver down my spine. I wonder if what I saw that night was real, if the boundaries between our ordinary lives and something far more mysterious had briefly overlapped. Sometimes I lie awake in the dark, replaying the scene over and over, questioning whether I was simply scared senseless, or if there was truly another world, just a hair's breadth away from the one I knew. I've never told anyone this before, but the memory of that night is both a burden and a comfort. a reminder that the world is vast and filled with secrets that defy logic and explanation. Even as I grew older, I never quite shook the feeling that I had witnessed something otherworldly, something that had brushed against my life in a way that was both fleeting and profound. There are moments when I catch myself staring out the window at dusk, half expecting to see that same orange glow, that silent, hovering craft replacing a familiar structure with an unspoken promise of mystery. I've come to accept that I might never fully understand what happened that night. Perhaps it was a dream, a vivid trick of my young mind under the weight of a restless night. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a glimpse into a reality where the impossible becomes possible. A fleeting window into a hidden world where houses vanish and saucers float silently over empty lots. I don't claim to know for certain, and I'm not sure I ever will, but in my heart, I know what I saw, and that knowledge continues to echo through the corridors of my memory. Now, whenever I feel the mundane weight of everyday life, I remember that night in Chicago, the night when a bright orange glow shattered the ordinary and left me forever changed. And though I've learned to rationalize and to live with the unanswered questions, there remains a small, persistent wonder that maybe, somewhere in the vast, shadowed corners of our universe, there are truths waiting to be uncovered. I still wonder, in those quiet moments before sleep, if the craft was ever real, or if it was just a product of my young, terrified mind. And sometimes, that question is the only thing that keeps me looking up at the sky, searching for another glimpse of the inexplicable. Hey everyone, if you found this channel gripping and want more real stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you're always in the loop. Redditor 2. Years ago, I woke up from a deep sleep with a clarity that struck me as if I'd been having a conversation with someone sitting right beside me. I'm not saying I was abducted. I just know what I experienced was as vivid as any real-life exchange. It started when I found myself in a place that felt both familiar and utterly alien. I was lying in my darkened room, the only light coming from the muted glow of a street lamp outside my window, when I suddenly became aware of a presence. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears as I listened to voices that weren't there, voices that told me things so detailed and granular that they seared themselves into my memory. One voice, clear and unwavering, said, "They've been here almost longer than us. They have bases under the ocean floors in various places." I couldn't move or speak. It was as if the words were transmitted directly into my mind. The voice went on, its tone both matter-of-fact and strangely mournful. "They've installed sonic repellents near the entrances of these bases to deter sea life. The pressure differences? They had issues with large animals being sucked into their installations." Every word was delivered with an eerie precision, painting a picture of underwater fortresses and secret installations that defied logic. I sat there, frozen, my mind reeling as the information cascaded over me like icy water. Then, as if the conversation wasn't enough, another image formed in my vision, a small device about the size of a key ring. I remember its details so clearly. A set of tiny loops through which you could slide your thumb and finger. When you pulled it open, it revealed a hologram that danced in the dim light. The mechanism was almost playful, a springy feel that made the device snap shut if you weren't careful to hold it open. I wanted to reach out and grab it, to examine it with my own hands, but I was trapped in a state of disbelief. It felt as though I'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of our reality, a secret meant only for those who have seen too much. I recall scribbling frantic notes in a notebook, trying to capture every word, every detail, but even then, the memory of it was as slippery as smoke. I tried to hold on to the recollection, to force it into coherence, but it was like trying to catch light in your hands. I found myself stumbling through a series of corridors that defied the normal laws of architecture. I was in what I could only describe as the interior of a ship. Perhaps the back of a cargo plane, if you can imagine such a thing. The space was bathed in a dim orange-brown light that made everything look like it was smudged with soot. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, they were one continuous smooth curve, devoid of any right angles. It was as if I were inside a vast, undulating cave, the surfaces merging seamlessly into one another. The only color that broke the monotony was the soft pulsing of blue and purple lights, arranged in neat quarters, that slowly pulsed downward like the gentle beat of a heart. I wandered those halls, my feet shuffling against the slick surface, every step echoing in a silence that was almost oppressive. I wasn't entirely sure where I was going. It felt like I was being led somewhere, though I could never quite tell if I was walking or simply drifting. The experience was disorienting. My recollection is hazy, as if I were stumbling through the corridors of a forgotten memory while being shown secrets I wasn't ready to understand. I recall the sensation of cold metal under my fingertips, the faint hum of energy that vibrated through the air, and the way my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in that confined space. As I continued, the voice returned, softer now, as if it were a distant echo from another dimension. It spoke of ship designs too advanced for our understanding, describing vessels that moved silently through the void, their structures unbound by the constraints of physics as we know them. I remember the voice detailing blue and purple lights that pulsed in sync with a rhythm not of this earth, and floors that curved upward seamlessly to meet the walls. It was as though I was witnessing a living, breathing entity, a craft that was as much a part of some cosmic ecosystem as it was a machine built by hands unknown. I tried to ask questions, though no sound escaped my lips. I was a silent observer, forced to absorb a torrent of information without the ability to interact. It felt like the experience was meant to be both a revelation and a test, an induction into a secret that had been hidden from humanity for eons. The voice hinted that once you truly understand the nature of these beings, everything becomes wondrous and terrifying all at once. Then, without warning, the scene shifted. I found myself back in my room, the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, and the weight of the dream lifted as suddenly as it had come. For a few moments, I lay there, disoriented and drenched in sweat, my mind racing to determine whether what I'd experienced was real or simply a vivid, inexplicable dream. I couldn't shake the feeling that every detail, the voice, the device, the smooth, endless corridors bathed in orange light, was more than mere fantasy. In the days that followed, I scoured old notes and tried to reconstruct every nuance of that encounter, but much had faded, as if it had been scrubbed from my memory. I sought out threads on online forums, looking for others who claimed similar experiences. I found hints of a community of contactees, people who, like me, were left with fragments of knowledge too profound to be dismissed. They spoke of alien presences, of messages delivered not in words, but in sensations and fleeting images. I wasn't sure what to believe, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of a memory, a flash of blue, the feel of cold metal, the sound of a voice that was not meant for this world. Even now I live with the uncertainty. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I find myself wondering if the universe is trying to tell us something, that these encounters are not random, but part of a larger, hidden tapestry of truth. I don't know why I was chosen, or if I invited these revelations by simply being open to the inexplicable. It might be a curse, a gift, or something in between. And while I've tried to rationalize it as nothing more than a terrifying dream, there are details that refuse to fade away. A keyring device that snaps shut with a precise, almost deliberate click, and corridors where the laws of space bend into smooth, unending curves. I still keep a small notebook where I jot down these memories, though the pages are now more ink than clarity. Each entry is a reminder that the world is vaster and stranger than I ever imagined as a child peering out a window in Chicago. And though I live a life that seems ordinary on the surface, work, friends, the mundane rhythms of everyday existence, I carry this secret within me, a persistent echo of a night when reality and the unknown collided. Sometimes I wonder if, as I grew older and sought explanations, the vision receded, leaving behind only half-remembered fragments. But other times, especially when I feel the chill of night air on my skin or see a glint of light in a darkened room, I know that the truth is still out there, hidden in plain sight. I don't claim to have all the answers, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I do know that what I experienced was real in its own way, an encounter that forever blurred the line between dreams and reality and left me with a hunger to understand the mysteries that lie just beyond our grasp. And so I carry on, haunted yet hopeful, forever looking up at the sky, listening for that distant voice, and wondering if one day I might finally piece together the fragments of that unforgettable night. Editor 3. That night still haunts me in a way I can't quite put into words. It was during a camping trip at a small campground in Northgate, and the weather had turned against us. The rain was coming down in sheets, forcing everyone to abandon their tents in the woods and rent one of the on-site cabins. My friends were all in for the extra social time the cabin offered. They planned to stay up late swapping stories and jokes, while I, exhausted from a long day of kayaking, opted to sleep in my car. I figured I'd catch a few more hours of sleep on the drive home later. I woke up sometime after the rain had stopped. The chill in the car made me shiver, and that's when I realized I'd left my sleeping bag back in my tent. I had a brief moment of indecision. The cabin was full, its warm lights still glowing, and all my friends were fast asleep. It was around 3 a.m. by the time I mustered the courage to check, but I didn't want to squeeze into a cramped space with everyone. Instead, I decided to trek back to my tent in the dark, armed only with a small penlight and my mounting desperation for warmth. The campground was eerily silent as I made my way along the narrow path between tents. My tent was the last one on the row, isolated, at least 50 feet away from the nearest shelter. Every step felt heavy, and the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel under my boots. When I finally reached my tent, I slid inside, quickly pulled the zipper closed, and huddled under my thin blanket, trying to capture what little sleep I could before sunrise. No more than 10 or 15 minutes after I'd settled in, I began to hear something that sent a jolt through my body, a series of light, breathy whispers right outside the tent door. They weren't in English or any language I recognized. The murmurs were indecipherable, a constant, low cadence that floated in the air like a secret I wasn't meant to understand. My heart hammered, and my mind raced through 100 possibilities, none of them comforting. Then, as if summoned by the voices, 2 orbs materialized outside my tent. They were not the harsh glare of flashlights, but rather gentle, shifting lights of different colors. Colors I couldn't quite name, luminous and ever-changing, casting a surreal glow against the darkness. I lay completely still, too terrified to move. Watching as the orbs began to drift together, the whispers outside escalated, their tone turning almost into a hushed argument, an exchange so soft yet insistent that it filled the small space around my tent with a strange, unsettling presence. I could see the light swirling slowly around my tent, first behind me, then to the side, and finally in front. Their movement was not random or jittery like a flashlight beam. It was deliberate and smooth, like a slow, circular dance. No footsteps or rustling of leaves accompanied them. The only sound was those whispered voices, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. I felt frozen, as though my body had betrayed me and I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. My mind screamed at me to choose, fight or flee. I slowly unzipped the tent door, my hands trembling so badly I could hardly hold the fabric. I knelt on the cold tent floor, every inch of my body screaming in silent terror. I braced myself for the moment when the zipper might suddenly tear open, as if in some grisly scene from a horror movie, exposing whatever lurked in the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat echoing in the small space, and sweat trickled down my neck despite the chill in the air. For what felt like an eternity, the swirling lights and whispering voices held me captive in that frozen moment. I could do nothing but watch, my mind racing with 1,000 desperate questions. Then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. The lights, which had been moving with an almost hypnotic precision, shut off abruptly, like someone flipped a switch. The whispers faded, leaving nothing but an oppressive, complete silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I sat there, motionless in the darkness of my tent, the silence so profound it felt as if the world itself had paused. I didn't dare move, my body rooted by fear, until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. Only then did I finally emerge, every step away from that tent weighted with the memory of those inexplicable moments. Even now, I can still recall that night with a clarity that chills me. Recently, I went to a horror movie premiere, and during one scene, a sequence with soft, indecipherable voices and eerie ambient sounds, I got goosebumps that raced up my arm. It was identical to what I experienced in that lonely tent in the woods. A reminder that sometimes the line between nightmares and reality blurs so completely that you're left questioning everything. I've never talked about that night much, mostly because every time I do, the memory is as raw as if it were happening again. There are no rational explanations for what I saw. The shifting, colorful orbs, the unintelligible whispers, the sudden, jarring silence, and the isolation of that moment still haunts me. I don't know if what I experienced was a hallucination, a trick of the dark, or something else entirely. A presence that chose that moment to reveal itself to me. I often wonder if the forest around that campground still holds that secret, if somewhere in the silent woods, the whispers and swirling lights wait for another unsuspecting soul. Until then, I live with the lingering dread of that night, a persistent echo of a terror that I've never truly escaped. And every time I pass a dark, quiet place, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a flash of color, a glimpse of those eerie lights dancing just out of reach. Redditor 4. There's one night from my teenage years that still sends a shiver down my spine. A night that blurred the line between reality and something utterly unexplainable. I was about 15, and every night, my friend Jay and I would sneak out at midnight, our hearts pounding with a mix of rebellion and exhilaration. We'd wander into the darkness and make our way back home before our parents awoke, the hours stretching between 12 and 5 a.m., like a secret promise of freedom. That night, however, would etch itself into my memory forever. After our usual escapade, we found ourselves in my backyard, a small patch of grass beneath a star-splattered sky. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that makes every sound seem amplified. We climbed onto my old trampoline, a relic that creaked under our weight, and lay there, staring up at the cosmos. Jay and I would always talk about the stars, about galaxies and possibilities beyond our mundane lives. But that night, something was different. I remember how clear the night was. Every star shone with a brilliance that made the sky seem endless, yet there was a peculiar distortion in the air. As I lay there, half listening to Jay's low murmurs about constellations, I became aware of something impossible. It started subtly at first, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the sky. But then, as if someone had pressed a switch, the vast dome above us transformed. The smooth, continuous expanse of stars was replaced by sharp edges, the sky suddenly looking like a cube, every corner defined by crisp lines. I could almost see the invisible boundaries where the familiar met something alien. Before I could process what was happening, from the southeast corner of that new, angular sky, a massive shape emerged. I stared, heart pounding, as a giant object appeared, so enormous it seemed to take up a quarter of the entire sky. It was unmistakably a UFO, a perfect metallic saucer that spun slowly in place. It didn't roar or rumble. Its movement was eerily silent, the only sound the distant whisper of wind in the trees. Jay's eyes met mine, and without a word, we both understood. We had just witnessed something extraordinary. The craft spun steadily, its sides rotating as if it were a living, breathing entity, and then, as if drawn by some unspoken command, it began moving toward us. I felt an instinctive chill, more than just the cool night air, an overwhelming urge to hide. Without a word, Jay and I exchanged a glance, and in that brief moment, it was as if our thoughts aligned. We both knew what we had to do. There was no time for panic or debate. It was simply an unspoken order. Stay flat. Don't move. In total, a silent agreement passed between us, and we flipped over onto our stomachs. The trampoline's surface creaked under our sudden shift, and we lay there, as still and flat as if we were part of the night itself. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, every thump echoing in the oppressive silence that enveloped us. We watched in frozen silence as the craft drew closer, its size and detail becoming more defined against the stark, cubed sky. Its spinning motion continued, the edges of the saucer moving like a slow, hypnotic dance. Yet it advanced steadily in our direction. For what felt like an eternity, though I'm sure it was only a few minutes, we held our breath, minds locked in a desperate bid for invisibility. The craft's movement was surreal. It began to trace a strange, sea-like curve across the sky, its path forming an angled arc that seemed to defy normal physics. I was hyper-aware of every sensation. the prickling of my skin against the cool night air, the dampness of my palms against the rough fabric of my jeans, and the silent, pounding fear that rooted me to the spot. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the UFO vanished. One moment it was there, hovering ominously as it moved closer, and the next it was gone, disintegrated into the darkness. In its place, a heavy stillness fell over the backyard, so complete it felt as though time itself had paused. I could barely breathe as I lay there, eyes wide open, processing the impossible disappearance. When we finally dared to move, Jay and I slowly sat up, our limbs trembling as if we had run a marathon in the middle of the night. I reached over and checked my phone. 1:15 a.m. flashed on the screen, confirming what my mind still refused to accept. But then, in a disorienting twist that blurred the line between nightmare and reality, the moment we lifted our bodies from the ground, the sky transformed. It was as if we had been suspended in a pocket of time. The darkness of midnight was suddenly replaced by a brightness that rivaled dawn. I don't remember much of the transition, only the abrupt, jarring light that made it feel like the day had burst forth in an instant. The clock read 7:30 a.m. in that flash of light, a surreal leap forward that left us reeling. Jay and I exchanged long, silent looks, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. In that instant, the weight of the experience pressed down on us, a mix of relief and unspoken terror. We made a break for our homes, sprinting through the cool, early morning air, our minds still trapped in the reverberations of that strange, inexplicable night. Over the years, I've recounted that night to anyone who would listen, though many dismiss it as an overactive imagination fueled by teenage nerves. My brother's girlfriend, who is obsessed with every scrap of alien lore, believes we were abducted. She's even started texting me at odd hours, saying she can't sleep thinking about how time seemed to stretch and collapse in that moment. I laugh it off, trying to rationalize the event as a trick of the mind, a shared hallucination brought on by the adrenaline of sneaking out. Yet, even as I joke, I can't shake the nagging feeling of lost time. There was a moment, a clear, undeniable gap between what we experienced and the waking world. That still irks me to this day. I don't know if what we saw was a real alien craft or if the whole event was simply a terrifying dream, but I do know this. That night, on a warm summer evening, when the stars shifted into a cube and a massive UFO descended upon our backyard, something extraordinary happened. And though I may never fully understand what it meant or why it happened, I carry the memory with me, a mix of wonder and dread that reminds me that the universe is full of secrets, waiting silently in the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, when I catch a glimpse of an oddly shaped cloud or see the reflection of something unexplainable in a window, I think back to that night with Jay. I wonder if, somewhere out there, our fleeting encounter was part of something far larger, a cosmic puzzle with pieces scattered across time and space. And in those moments, the lines between what I once believed to be a simple teenage escapade and the unfathomable mysteries of the universe blur into one. Redditor 5. There was a night that changed everything. A night where reality itself seemed to unravel in front of my eyes. I had taken DMT that evening, something I'd been curious about for months, hoping to glimpse the hidden layers of existence. I was 15 then, and every decision felt monumental. I remember the familiar weight of anticipation as I inhaled, feeling the chemical warmth spread through my veins. In that moment, time slowed, and I was plunged into a world where nothing was as it seemed. I woke up strapped to a cold metallic table, the sterile scent of disinfectant mingling with the lingering aroma of the substance. The table was unyielding, its surface smooth and uncomfortably hard against my skin. My limbs were pinned down, the straps biting into my flesh with an icy precision. Panic should have surged through me, but strangely, a sense of calm washed over me. I couldn't move, couldn't even shift a muscle, and yet, I felt inexplicably safe. Across from me, towering nearly 7 feet tall, stood a being that defied all rational description. It resembled a gigantic praying mantis, its elongated limbs and spindly antennae casting eerie shadows in the dim light. Its body shimmered with a metallic sheen, and its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with a soft, pulsating light. Instead of speaking in any audible language, it communicated by emitting a series of chirps and clicks. The sounds were musical, almost hypnotic, and they resonated directly inside my head, bypassing my ears entirely. I understood every nuance of its message without a single word being spoken aloud. It assured me telepathically that I was not in any danger. The being's presence was both alien and deeply familiar, as if it were reaching out with an understanding older than time itself. I could feel its intentions, gentle and cautious, as it conveyed ideas and images that I struggled to decipher. It spoke of vast cosmic truths, of secrets hidden beneath the surface of reality, a whispered lore about beings that had visited Earth long before humanity even took its first breath. The vividness of the communication was overwhelming. Each thought it planted in my mind was as clear as if I were reading a book written in plain language. Even now, I can recall the granular details, the rhythmic pattern of its clicks, the way its elongated fingers brushed the air as though testing my presence, the subtle vibrations that seemed to ripple through the metal table itself. Every sensation was heightened, the cool shock of the metal against my skin, the persistent echoing throb of my heartbeat, the strange mix of fear and wonder that held me captive in that moment. Despite being bound and utterly helpless, I felt an odd sense of serenity. It was as though, in that suspended state, I had become part of something much larger, something beyond the confines of my human understanding. I spent what felt like an eternity in that state, absorbing the cascade of images and emotions. At times, I wondered if this entire experience was merely a mad DMT trip, a vivid hallucination conjured by my overstimulated mind. The precision of the encounter, however, defied the random chaos of a typical psychedelic journey. It was too structured, too intentional, as if the substance had somehow unlocked a door to a hidden memory, one that I was meant to forget, but had been forcefully returned to me by these entities. There was a part of me that still hesitates when I try to explain it. Was it all just an elaborate drug-induced illusion? Or had I actually been contacted by beings whose existence I had always dismissed as fantasy? I remember the way my mind clung to every detail, the image of that towering mantis-like figure etching itself into my memory with a stark clarity that felt like a half-remembered dream resurfacing from my childhood. It was as if a part of me, long suppressed and hidden away, had been awakened by the encounter, a memory not of my own making, but one implanted by forces beyond our understanding. I often lie awake at night, haunted by fragments of that experience. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I sense that same presence hovering at the edge of my consciousness, a gentle reminder that perhaps there is more to our existence than the mundane routine of everyday life. I wish, more than anything, that these entities would respect our autonomy. The thought of being strapped down, of having your will overridden by beings from another realm, is terrifying. I find myself silently pleading that they would one day ask, rather than simply impose their will, that we join them in their cosmic endeavors. I have tried to rationalize it all over the years. I tell myself that it was just the drug, that DMT is known for its hyper-realistic visions, that my brain was simply piecing together fragments of neural activity in ways it never had before. And yet, the specificity of the images, the gentle cadence of its clicks, the meticulous details of its form, the way it seemed to communicate directly with my mind, makes me wonder if it was more than just a hallucination. It felt like an awakening, a moment when the layers of reality peeled back to reveal a truth that had been hidden from me for far too long. I sometimes imagine that I was chosen by these entities, that perhaps I had some role to play, however insignificant it might be, in a cosmic drama that spans millennia. Maybe they had been here long before us, and they had deliberately woven themselves into our history, shaping memories and experiences so that we would remain blissfully unaware until the time was right. I still search for answers in old texts and obscure online threads, looking for someone who might have experienced something similar, hoping to piece together the larger puzzle. But for now, I can only cling to the memory, a memory that is both a blessing and a curse. It fills me with a sense of wonder that sometimes borders on dread. I have no definitive answer, and I don't know if I ever will. All I know is that in that moment, strapped to a cold metal table with a being whose very presence defies explanation, I was shown a truth that shook me to my core. Whether it was a mad DMT trip or an awakening of a forgotten memory, implanted by these mysterious entities. It felt real, impossibly real, like an old, half-forgotten memory returning to claim its place in my life. Even now, as I navigate the mundane rhythms of everyday existence, I find myself looking up at the night sky with a lingering sense of anticipation and wariness. I wonder if, somewhere out there, those beings are watching, waiting for the right moment to reach out again. And until that day comes, I'll keep this secret close, a haunting reminder that the universe is far stranger than we dare to imagine. Redditor 6. Sometimes I lie awake at night, my skin prickling with the memory of that night. It began like any other ordinary evening in my cramped apartment, a modest, dimly lit space where the hum of the city barely reached the higher floors. I had climbed into my usual sleeping arrangement on the top bunk of my narrow, rickety bed, a small sanctuary from the relentless pace of urban life. The room was quiet except for the soft whispers of the wind against the window and the distant murmur of traffic far below. I drifted off, my mind slowly surrendering to sleep. Hours later, I was rudely pulled from that oblivion by a searing, blinding light. It was like someone had shined a spotlight directly into my eyes, forcing me awake with its intense brightness. Groggy and disoriented, I squinted in the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. At first, I thought it was a trick of my dream, an errant hallucination fueled by exhaustion. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized that the light was coming from my bedroom window, flooding the room with an otherworldly glow. I pushed myself up on the thin mattress, my heart hammering in my chest as I stumbled out of the top bunk. The beam of light was steady and unyielding, painting everything in stark, eerie contrast. With every step, I felt the weight of a dread I couldn't quite explain. Reaching the window, I peered out into the night, expecting to see chaos or people scrambling in terror. Instead, I found something far stranger. Hovering in the darkness above my apartment was a huge, triangular craft. Its edges were sharp and defined, cutting through the night sky with an impossible precision. The craft emitted an iridescent glow, a pulsating blend of white and cold blue that seemed to seep into the very air around it. I stared, frozen in disbelief. The familiar skyline of my city had vanished from view, replaced by this colossal, mysterious object that dominated the heavens like an unwelcome visitor. My mind raced, each thought a frantic plea for logic. Surely, if such a craft were present, the world below would erupt into pandemonium. I looked down from my window, expecting to see people on the street fleeing in terror, drivers slamming on brakes, and sirens blaring. Instead, the scene was disturbingly mundane. The few passers-by I could glimpse on the dimly lit street had vacant, zombie-like expressions, their eyes glazed over as if caught in a trance. Cars stopped at green lights with drivers staring blankly ahead, completely oblivious to the spectacle above them. It was as if the entire city had fallen under a spell, their minds disconnected from the world around them. Then, in an instant that seared itself into my memory, the craft shifted its focus. One of its other lights, sharp and piercing, flashed toward me, bathing my face in an unrelenting, almost painful brightness. The light was so intense that I had to shield my eyes, and for a moment everything went black. I don't remember much after that flash. My thoughts turned hazy and the edges of the room blurred into nothingness. When I finally came to, I realized something was inexplicably different. I was no longer on the top bunk. Somehow, in the aftermath of that bewildering encounter, I had sleepwalked, and I don't know whether I was dreaming or in a waking nightmare, down the narrow ladder to the bottom bunk. The transition was surreal. One moment I was frozen in terror, and the next I found myself lying on the lower bed, the remnants of my chaotic night clinging to me like a second skin. I lay there for what felt like ages, my mind reeling with a jumble of fragmented memories. Was it all just a vivid, drugged dream conjured by my overtaxed brain? Or had I truly witnessed something that defied the laws of nature? The memory was as granular as if I'd been handed a set of puzzle pieces that I couldn't quite assemble, each piece more disjointed than the last. The idea that I had been abducted, or that some entity had reached out to me through that blinding flash of light, made my skin crawl. Yet, at the same time, a small part of me, one that I dared not acknowledge, wondered if this was a memory forced upon me, a fragment of a reality I was meant to forget. I spent the remainder of the night huddled under a thin blanket, my eyes intermittently drifting to the window in a futile hope of catching another glimpse of that spectral craft. The city outside remained in its eerie lull, the passers-by and drivers continuing their monotonous, unseeing routines. I didn't hear any sounds, no sirens, no frantic shouts, only the relentless pulse of my own heartbeat echoing in the quiet room. When the first hints of dawn crept in, washing the sky with pale light, I finally dared to rise. The traumatic events of the night had left me rattled, yet I moved with a detached numbness, as if in a trance. I tried to piece together every detail, the searing light that woke me, the ghostly craft that hovered above my window, the surreal calm of the street below. Every moment was etched with a clarity that made the rational world seem inadequate, a world where the extraordinary could intrude at any moment, unannounced and unexplainable. I spent that day in a haze, half dreaming, half wondering if I had imagined it all. I replayed the experience over and over in my mind, questioning whether the DMT of sleep had blurred the line between waking and dreaming. How could I have sleepwalked and yet retained the full intensity of that encounter? Was it all a hallucination, nothing more than the overactive imagination of a frightened child? Or was it something real, something that defied explanation, leaving behind a void of unanswered questions that I still feel today? Years have passed since that night, but every time I lie awake and the darkness feels oppressive, I remember the blinding light, the haunting craft, and the empty, trance-like faces of those below. The memory continues to lurk at the edge of my consciousness, a chilling reminder that our reality is fragile and that sometimes, just when we think we are alone, the extraordinary comes calling. I don't know if it was a dream or if I truly witnessed something not of this world, but one thing remains undeniable. That night changed me. Every time I pass a window at night or see a fleeting shadow in the sky, I wonder if, somewhere out there, that mystery still watches, waiting for the next moment to break through our fragile reality. Redditor 7. Sometimes my memories return with a weight that feels too heavy for a 4-year-old to bear. I was just 4 when it happened, a night that has haunted me in ways I only understood much later. I remember the gentle hum of the summer night, the cool breeze slipping through the open window, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of my sister sleeping soundly in the bed beside me. Our small bedroom was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the window, and everything seemed as it always was, until it wasn't. I was lying in my crib, or perhaps more accurately on my little bed, when a sudden, blinding light shattered the silence. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but everything felt so vivid, so real, like I was wide awake in the midst of a nightmare. I tried to move, to cry out, but my body was frozen, as if wrapped in invisible chains. My eyes darted around in terror, trying to make sense of the impossible scene unfolding before me. Through the haze of my confusion, I saw them, creatures unlike any I had ever seen. They slipped into my room through the open window, gliding silently on an otherworldly current of air. Their heads were enormous, oversized for their thin, fragile bodies, and their eyes were vast pools of black, like endless voids that swallowed up any light. Their skin shimmered under the moonlight, and though I was too young to understand, I sensed that they were not here to harm me. Yet, I was completely terrified. I remember the way the light of the night refracted off their large eyes, casting eerie reflections on the walls, as if the room had been transformed into a surreal stage. I wanted to scream, to call out to someone for help, but not a sound emerged from my throat. It was as if my voice had been stolen, leaving me trapped in a silent horror. Every second stretched out interminably, and I felt as if I were caught between a waking nightmare and a half-forgotten dream. Time became a strange, unyielding force that held me captive. I was paralyzed, unable to cry, unable to move, completely at the mercy of those beings who had invaded my safe space. My sister, oblivious in her deep sleep, continued to breathe softly beside me, a comforting presence that only made the contrast of my terror all the more acute. The creatures communicated in a language I couldn't comprehend, a series of quiet, deliberate sounds that resonated inside my head rather than my ears. They seemed to be saying something, their thoughts brushing the edges of my mind, but I couldn't piece together any meaning. All I felt was the overwhelming sensation of being watched, studied, and somehow, unaccountably, left unharmed. After what felt like an eternity in that frozen moment, the beings slowly retreated. One by one, they disappeared out the window, leaving behind only the lingering glow of their presence. I don't remember exactly how long I lay there in that silence, hours it might have been, but eventually the paralysis loosened its grip. In a daze, I managed to crawl out of bed, my little body trembling uncontrollably. I dragged myself across the cold floor, driven by a desperate need to find comfort and safety. With each labored movement, I could feel the residual shock of what had just occurred seeping into every bone and nerve. I eventually reached my parents' room. In the dim hallway light, I must have looked like a tiny, disheveled shadow of terror. My mom found me, her arms immediately wrapping around my shaking form. I didn't speak for an entire day. I couldn't find the words to describe the nightmare, and even now the images refused to coalesce into a coherent story. All I knew was that I was terrified, and that I had seen something so inexplicably real that the memory still sends shivers down my spine. Years passed, and the raw pain of that night slowly dulled into a strange sort of numbness. I grew up, and the incident became an unspoken chapter of my early childhood, a mysterious, inexplicable event that I couldn't share without feeling exposed. It wasn't until I was an adult that I stumbled upon descriptions of sleep paralysis, and suddenly, the pieces started to fit. I learned that many people experience hallucinations and terrifying visions while in that liminal state between sleep and wakefulness. The revelation was both a relief and a new source of dread. It meant that what had happened to me wasn't unique or supernatural, but rather a phenomenon of the mind, a glitch in the circuitry of sleep. Even with this knowledge, a part of me still clings to that ancient fear. I try to dismiss it as a product of my young, overactive imagination, yet every time I see a shadow shift at the corner of my eye, I wonder if those dark, enormous eyes are still watching from some hidden corner of my memory. My sister grew up without ever knowing, her memories of that night blurred by the innocence of sleep. My mom, ever patient and protective, never pressed me for details, and for that I remain eternally grateful. There are nights when the wind whistles outside my window and the darkness seems to pulse with unseen life. In those moments, I can almost feel the touch of that indescribable presence, a lingering whisper that recalls the terror of that long-ago night. I often lie awake, heart pounding and mind racing, unable to shake the sensation that the creatures might return, if only to remind me that the boundary between dreams and reality is far thinner than I ever imagined. I've come to accept that the memory might be nothing more than a hallucination, an amalgam of a sleep-paralyzed mind and the raw, unfiltered fears of a child. And yet, despite all my rationalizations, the vividness of that experience continues to haunt me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the enormous heads and bottomless eyes of those beings, hear the faint, unearthly sounds of their communication, and feel once again the crushing weight of that silent terror. I don't know if it was real or if it was simply the mind's way of manifesting its deepest fears. I only know that the experience left an indelible mark on my soul, a reminder that sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary dissolves, revealing secrets that are both horrifying and profoundly beautiful. And though it has been decades since that night, the memory remains a part of me, an unresolved echo in the chambers of my heart, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. Redditor 8. I was 10 years old, living in Calgary, Alberta, in 1978, a time when the world seemed simpler, yet I would soon learn that beneath the surface of everyday life lay secrets too vast to understand. It was a late afternoon in early autumn around 4:30 p.m. when I was walking home from school. I had stayed for volleyball practice on the school sports field, and while all the other kids had long since left, I lingered on that empty, sun-dappled field. The school and my house were close by. Our home sat just across the street from the school. With no other children around, I enjoyed the solitude and the feeling of being the sole witness to a moment that, in hindsight, was far more profound than I could ever have imagined. As I strolled across the field, a subtle movement caught my attention from the corner of my eye. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart beginning to thump faster and turned sharply to the right. There, hovering directly above a house facing the schoolyard, was something that made my young mind freeze in disbelief. It was a massive object, so enormous it nearly touched the roof of the house below it. The craft was triangular, its edges crisp and defined, and it dominated the sky in a way that made everything else seem insignificant. I estimated it must have been about 150 feet across and perhaps 25 to 30 feet tall, a leviathan of metal and light. The object emitted a harsh, brilliant white light that was almost painful to behold. I shielded my eyes instinctively, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. Every detail of the craft was etched in my mind: the smooth, reflective surface, the sharp angles that cut across the sky, and the surreal way it seemed to float without any visible means of propulsion. For a long moment, I stood rooted in place, my breath caught in my throat. I looked back toward my house and noticed a car and a motorcycle parked on the side street that intersected with the road by the UFO. That street was only about half a block away, and yet I was baffled that neither driver nor anyone on the street seemed to react. Their faces wore a vacant, almost zombie-like expression, and the traffic moved on as if nothing extraordinary was unfolding in the heavens above. It was as if the entire world had been lulled into a daze while I was left to witness something beyond comprehension. Then, an overwhelming force, unseen yet unmistakable, drove my head back toward the UFO. I tried to fight it, to turn away, but my body simply wouldn't obey. I was trapped in that moment. My limbs felt as though they had been rendered useless by a power I couldn't resist. A surge of panic flooded through me. I remember the rush of cold fear and the way my heart pounded in my ears as I struggled against the invisible grip that compelled me to watch. I felt as if I were being pulled into the very essence of that craft, my mind screaming for escape even as my body betrayed me. The next thing I recall is a jarring dislocation in time. When I finally regained control of my limbs, if it was indeed me, I found myself walking into my house. The transition was bizarre. I had no memory of how I got from the field to my front door, nor do I know how the hours had passed. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. when I stepped into the dim light of our home. Outside, it was dark and unnervingly quiet. I could sense that something was profoundly wrong, but my mind was still reeling from the force that had overtaken me on the field. Inside, chaos reigned. My parents and my two older brothers had been frantic, searching for me for what must have been hours. Their voices echoed with worry and anger. I later learned that my parents were furious not just because I was late, but because my new school shoes were ruined, scuffed and dirty, as if I had been dragged face down along the ground, my feet scraping mercilessly. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words tangled in confusion. Instead, a strange, calm voice had whispered in my head during that inexplicable compulsion, urging me to tell my parents that I wasn't feeling well and needed to go to bed. I followed that suggestion without fully understanding why, and soon I found myself retreating to my room, shutting out the questions and anger with sleep. For a long time, I couldn't speak about that day. I told my older brothers what I remembered, but they only urged me to keep quiet, claiming that nobody would believe such an absurd tale. The memory, however, haunted me. I would lie awake at night, my mind replaying every moment: the blinding white light, the enormous triangular craft hovering so close, the eerie indifference of the world around me. I questioned whether it was all a dream, a drug of my imagination, or a true encounter with something not of this world. In the quiet hours after the incident, as I stared at the ceiling in my darkened room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been touched by something extraordinary. The lack of reaction from the people on the street, the uncontrollable pull that forced me to watch the UFO, and the loss of several hours in a blink, all of it conspired to leave a lingering, unexplainable void. I began to wonder if I had somehow been altered that day, if the encounter had marked me in a way I could neither comprehend nor describe. Now, years later, I still find myself drawn to the night sky. There's a persistent urge to look up, to search for that fleeting glimpse of something more, a secret that the universe might be keeping hidden. I often wonder if the force that pulled me toward that UFO was a signal, a message meant only for those who are open enough to see beyond the ordinary. Perhaps it was a glimpse into a realm where time and space lose their meaning, where the familiar rules of our world are suspended for a brief, terrifying moment. I've tried to piece together every detail in my mind, yet much remains hazy, as if part of the memory has been deliberately obscured. What I do know is that on that day in Calgary, when I was 10 years old, I experienced something that defies all rational explanation. A moment when the boundaries between reality and the unknown dissolved, leaving behind a mystery that still haunts me. I still wonder, was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or was it a genuine encounter with an extraterrestrial force? A reminder that the universe is far larger and more mysterious than I ever imagined. Even now, as I pass by familiar streets and gaze out at the quiet night sky, I can't help but feel that if I listened closely enough, I might once again sense the pull of that inexplicable force, a faint echo of that fateful day when a giant UFO hovered over a house and my life was forever changed. Redditor 9. I was 12 years old, living in a place so remote that the only company was the desolate stretch of land and the echoes of long-forgotten military secrets. We were near what was once known as the INL, the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory, a place infamous for its strange happenings when it was active. That day, as ordinary as any other, turned into something out of a nightmare. It was around 2 p.m. on a clear, sunlit afternoon. My mother and I were driving along a dusty backcountry road, the kind that winds through barren fields and forgotten construction sites. The heat shimmered on the asphalt, and I remember the radio playing low, comforting tunes as we cruised along. I was gazing out the window, lost in the endless blue sky, when something caught my eye. A glimmer of metallic silver far off in the distance. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and then it became unmistakable. A huge, otherworldly craft. I nudged my mother. "Mom, look." "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread. She turned, and in the direction I indicated, her eyes widened. There, looming in the sky above the INL, was a UFO. A goddamned UFO. It was impossible to ignore, a massive spinning silver disc that seemed to hover effortlessly like a giant tea saucer suspended in midair. Without a word, we pulled off the highway into a nearby rest area, a small lot with a scattering of parked cars and a few people milling about. I could see that the other witnesses were as shocked as we were. A group of folks clustered together, phones out, snapping photos of the surreal spectacle. The rest area was about 5 miles from the INEL, yet the craft dominated the sky as if it were the centerpiece of a cosmic exhibition. I recalled the object with stark clarity. It was enormous. Its diameter must have been around 150 feet across, with a height that reached nearly 30 feet. The craft's surface glistened under the harsh white light it emitted, so bright that it hurt my eyes if I stared too long. It hovered over the main building of the INL, circling around what looked like a reactor. Then, as if performing a choreographed dance, it lowered behind a massive concrete wall. For a few heartbeats, I could see every angle, every shimmering curve of the saucer, as it rotated with a hypnotic precision that defied any explanation I knew, even then. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to move. I remember the exact moment. Less than 3 minutes after it had come into view, the craft accelerated smoothly, gliding upward into the wide open sky. It moved with a smoothness that belied any conventional means of propulsion. I watched, awestruck, as it shrank into a distant speck, a tiny fading dot swallowed by the vast heavens, until, finally, it vanished altogether. I couldn't shake the strangeness of it all. As we sat there at that lonely rest stop, the conversation buzzed with theories and incredulous whispers. People debated what it could be, a top-secret military experiment, an alien visitation, or just an elaborate optical illusion caused by heat waves. I, however, knew what I had seen. It was too real. The silver gleam, the precise motion, the eerie absence of any sound from the craft that defied the laws of physics. My mother, usually the voice of calm reason, was as silent as I was, her face a mixture of wonder and unease. Later that day, when we finally returned home, I couldn't help but replay every moment in my mind. I was haunted by the image of that spinning colossal saucer, and the way it had moved with an elegance that seemed both mechanical and inexplicably alive. I pored over every detail, how it hovered effortlessly, how its bright light made the entire landscape around the inn look like a scene from a science fiction movie, and how, in a matter of minutes, it had ascended into the sky and disappeared without a trace. For weeks, I couldn't focus on anything else. Every time I stepped outside, I would look up at the sky, half expecting to see that same gleam of silver. I remember asking my friends later if they'd ever seen anything like it, and many of them said they had witnessed strange phenomena in that region, yet nothing compared to what I had experienced that day. There was a tangible weight to it, a certainty that what I had seen was not a trick of the light or an overactive imagination, but something that belonged to a realm beyond our own. I still struggle to reconcile the smooth, almost ethereal way that craft departed with the mundane reality of the rest of that day. The vehicle we rode in was rattling along on a gravel road, and for a brief moment I felt that the entire universe had shifted its axis. I remember the quiet murmur of the wind in the fields, and the way the light played off the cracked windows of old buildings nearby. All of it felt insignificant compared to that moment of extraterrestrial wonder. My mother and I never spoke much of it afterward, as if acknowledging it would force us to confront a truth too vast for our everyday lives. Yet, whenever I catch a glimpse of a shiny object in the sky, or feel a sudden, inexplicable thrill while driving down a lonely road, I can't help but think of that day in Idaho. It remains etched in my memory as a reminder that even in the middle of nowhere, the universe still has secrets waiting to reveal themselves. Secrets that can upend the very fabric of what we believe to be real. Even now, years later, I find that memory both a source of wonder and a lingering question mark. Was it truly an alien craft? A visitor from a distant star system whose technology and intentions we cannot comprehend? Or was it simply an anomaly? A quirk of light and perspective that my young mind misinterpreted? I have no definitive answers, and perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the encounter all the more profound. I suppose, in the end, it doesn't matter whether there was a logical explanation. What matters is the way it made me feel, a heady mix of awe, fear, and a deep, unshakable sense that we are not alone. That day, in the middle of nowhere, I witnessed something that defied explanation, something that still fuels my curiosity and my dreams. And as I continue to gaze upward on clear nights, I carry with me the quiet hope that one day, the universe will reveal a little more of its hidden wonders, even if it means challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. Redditor 10. It was around 4 a.m., a time when the world was wrapped in a heavy, uncanny silence. I had just gotten out of bed to use the bathroom, my feet cold against the hardwood floor as I shuffled through the dimly lit apartment. The hum of the refrigerator and the soft murmur of the air conditioner were the only sounds, anchoring me in a world that felt both safe and mundane. I reached the bathroom and flicked on the light, its harsh glare doing little to dispel the shadows dancing on the walls. I pulled back the curtain on the small window, expecting to see the usual inky blackness of night sprinkled with distant stars. Instead, my eyes were met with a vision that made my heart seize, a huge, brilliant ball of light hovering effortlessly in the sky. It was enormous and mesmerizing, bathed in a steady, unyielding glow that was almost painful to look at. There were no blinking lights, no flickers of color, and no visible wings or appendages, just a pure, radiant orb suspended in the darkness. I stood there, utterly transfixed, as the light seemed to pulse with a hypnotic rhythm, casting long, surreal shadows across the room. A chill crawled up my spine, and I felt a mix of wonder and deep instinctive fear. Something in me screamed that this was not part of any natural order I understood, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. The moment stretched on, and every second felt like an eternity. Shaken, I scrambled back to my room, my pulse thundering in my ears. My girlfriend was asleep, curled under a tangle of blankets, unaware of the phenomenon unfolding just a few feet away. I roused her with urgent whispers, my voice trembling as I explained what I had seen. Her eyes snapped open, and for a long moment, we exchanged a look filled with silent dread and shared disbelief. We quickly made our way back to the bathroom together, our footsteps light yet frantic on the cool floor. As we approached the window, the sight that met our eyes sent a new jolt of terror through us. The single orb had been replaced by two luminous spheres, perfectly circular and eerily silent. They floated at opposite ends of the sky, each emitting an intense, unwavering glow that made the darkness around them seem even more profound. We stood there, side by side, hardly daring to breathe as the two lights began to move. Slowly at first, then with a deliberate grace that defied explanation, they started drifting toward each other. It was as if some unseen force was drawing them together, their paths converging with a precision that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. The silence was absolute. No mechanical hum, no whisper of movement, just the soft, inexplicable glide of these mysterious orbs closing in on one another. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to escape from this surreal encounter, yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. The two lights inched closer until they were nearly colliding, and for those agonizing seconds it felt like the universe had paused. I remember my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest, each beat echoing in the heavy stillness of the night. Then, in one breathtaking instant, it all happened. As the spheres neared their meeting point, a flash of blinding brilliance erupted between them. It was as if the sky had been split open by that explosive brightness, an eruption of light that swallowed the two orbs in a heartbeat. I could feel the impact of that moment, a weightless shock that rippled through me, leaving my senses reeling. The light faded as quickly as it had flared, and when my vision cleared, the night was empty. There was nothing there, no orbs, no traces, just the deep, impenetrable black of the sky. We stood there, my girlfriend and I, our minds numb and hearts still racing. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, pressing in around us like a shroud. I wanted to scream, to call out for some explanation, but all that emerged was a choked whisper. We hurried back to our room, our frantic escape punctuated by trembling breaths and rapid, uneven steps. The terror we felt was not just the fear of what we saw, but of the inexplicable way it had vanished, leaving behind a void that defied logic. For a long time afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been touched by something otherworldly. The encounter replayed in my mind like a broken film, each frame vivid and filled with an intensity that refused to fade with the light of day. I spent countless nights lying awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering if what I had witnessed was a trick of my overactive imagination, a hallucination induced by the quiet of the early morning. But deep down, I knew it was real. The clarity of the light, the precise way the orbs moved together, it was something that defied the rules of nature. In the weeks that followed, I tried to explain it away to myself as a momentary lapse in perception, a fleeting anomaly that would soon be forgotten. But the memory clung to me, persistent and haunting. I even tried discussing it with friends, but their dismissive smiles and skeptical looks only deepened my isolation. I became obsessed with searching for an explanation, poring over articles, forums, and every scrap of evidence that might shed light on what I had experienced. Yet every lead dissolved into uncertainty, leaving me with only one undeniable truth. That night had changed me. Even now, when the night is exceptionally clear and the stars are scattered like distant promises across the sky, I catch myself glancing upward. I wonder if, somewhere out there, those orbs might reappear, drawn together by forces beyond our understanding, to remind me that the universe holds secrets too vast for us to ever fully grasp. And every time that thought crosses my mind, a silent, lingering echo of that terrifying yet mesmerizing night. I don't know what those lights were, and I may never find an answer that satisfies the questions burning inside me. But I do know that in that moment, at 4 a.m., I experienced something that transcended the ordinary. A fragment of the cosmos reaching out, if only for a heartbeat, to bridge the gap between our world and the infinite unknown. And though the memory remains a puzzle, a mystery woven into the fabric of my being, it also serves as a constant reminder that the universe is far more complex, far more strange than we dare to imagine.